When Dad remarried, I didn't expect much to change. At 12, I got used to the two of us being a team, and the idea of having new people around, a stepmom, Elaine, and a little stepsister named Sophie, was both exciting and a little nerve-wracking. I saw Sophie, who was 5, as someone I could protect and guide. I was ready to be a role model, to take on the role of big sister with pride. But within weeks of them moving in, the whole dynamic shifted in ways I could never have anticipated. Elaine was friendly enough, but her entire world seemed to revolve around Sophie. From the beginning, her rules, her schedules, and even her conversations all centered on what was best for her daughter. Dad, ever the peacemaker, made it his mission to keep Elaine happy, and slowly, I began to fade into the background. At first, I brushed it off. She was a new family member after all, and I was already close with Dad. But Sophie was a little actress in her own right. She had a way of manipulating situations that was way beyond her years, and soon, she was using it to her advantage. The first incident was small, almost laughable in hindsight. Sophie knocked over a vase, something she did all the time with her constant dancing and cartwheels. But this time, she blamed it on me. I saw her move it. She sniffled, pointing a little finger in my direction. Elaine turned to me with an eyebrow raised, and when I protested, Dad stepped in, urging me to be more considerate. It seemed like such a small misunderstanding, not worth fighting over, so I let it slide. But that was only the beginning. As the months went by, Sophie's little fibs turned into elaborate stories that painted me as careless, reckless, even mean-spirited. If something went missing, she'd cry and say I took it. If she fell or got hurt, she'd find a way to make it my fault. Elaine would scold me, and Dad, caught in the middle, would look at me with that disappointed look that cut deeper than anything he could have said. It was like Sophie was trying to reframe the narrative of our home, positioning herself as the innocent child and me as the troublesome one. No matter what I said, the doubt in Dad's eyes chipped away at my heart. I began withdrawing. My friends became my escape, and school became the one place where I felt seen and appreciated. I poured myself into my studies, hoping that academic achievements might finally get me some recognition. But at home, every achievement was overshadowed by Sophie's constant demands for attention. Whenever I tried to join family gatherings or add to a conversation, she'd manage to turn the spotlight back to herself with some crisis or performance. If we went out, she'd throw tantrums if I got even a fraction of attention from Dad or Elaine. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, barely acknowledged unless something went wrong. By the time I hit high school, I'd given up trying to be a part of the family. Sophie's hold over Elaine and Dad's perception of me had solidified into an unshakable narrative. I was labeled the troublemaker, the one who caused tension. It was painful to be constantly misjudged, but I figured things would change as Sophie grew older. She'd see reason, I thought. But that was a naive hope, and as it turned out, Sophie was only getting started. As Sophie grew older, her manipulations became far more calculated, like she was perfecting her craft. By the time I reached my late teens, her little lies had evolved into full-blown fabrications, each one designed to chip away at my standing with Dad and Elaine. She no longer confined herself to petty accusations. Now, she was playing a longer game, crafting stories that painted me as a bad influence, someone who was spiraling out of control. I had always felt that she enjoyed seeing me squirm, but as her stories became more sinister, it was clear that she wanted me gone. The first time she hinted to Dad and Elaine that I was into drugs, I couldn't believe it. It seemed so absurd. But Sophie delivered the lie with a subtlety that had become her trademark, mentioning offhandedly that she'd seen strange people around me or had noticed my odd behavior. She'd lower her voice in that concerned way, glancing at Dad with wide, innocent eyes as if she hated to be the bearer of bad news. Dad's face would cloud with worry, and Elaine, ever vigilant for any threat to Sophie, would look at me like I was a stranger. When Dad confronted me about these rumors, his voice was heavy with disappointment. He didn't outright accuse me, but he didn't believe my denial either. "If there's something going on, you can tell us," he said, a plea hidden in his words. I tried to laugh it off, assuring him that Sophie was making it up. But doubt had already planted its roots in his mind, and I saw how that seed grew every time Sophie added to her lie. Then came the night that everything fell apart. I had been out with friends, desperately clinging to the few moments of peace I found outside my family's judgmental gaze. When I returned, I noticed an unfamiliar stillness in the house. As soon as I stepped inside, Dad and Elaine were waiting for me, standing at the base of the staircase with grim expressions. They didn't need to speak. The coldness in their eyes told me enough. I felt my stomach drop. Dad stepped forward, holding up a small, clear baggie filled with a white powder. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared, my mind racing, and then it hit me: Sophie. This was her doing. The disbelief, the betrayal, everything crashed over me at once. I sputtered, tried to explain, but the more I spoke, the colder Dad's face grew. Elaine folded her arms, staring at me like she was looking at a stranger, someone dangerous and untrustworthy. Sophie lingered behind them, a picture of heartbreak and worry. She clasped her hands, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and shook her head as if she was disappointed in me. The little smirk hidden at the corner of her mouth was barely noticeable, but I saw it. Only I knew that this was her moment of victory, that she'd orchestrated the entire scene. I tried everything to convince them that it wasn't mine. I begged, pleaded, and told them to search the entire house for any other evidence of this so-called lifestyle. But they had already made up their minds. Sophie's story had been woven too intricately, her lies too believable. To them, I was now the disgrace, the danger, and they were protecting the family by casting me out. In the end, they didn't even let me pack properly. They handed me a single bag, $100, and barely met my eyes as Dad muttered, "Maybe some time away will make you see the harm you're causing." His voice was cold, empty. The warmth, the trust, all of it was gone, replaced with the chill of someone who had turned his back for good. As I stepped out into the cold night, I felt utterly alone, betrayed by the people who were supposed to know me best. I glanced back at the house and caught sight of Sophie at the window, watching with a look of satisfaction that only I could see. The day I walked out of my family's house felt like the end of the life I'd known. I wandered through those first few nights numb, bouncing from one friend's couch to another. The shock was hard to shake. I was young, lost, and left with a handful of bills and a lifetime of hurt. Without my family, who I'd relied on for so much, I felt like a small, drifting leaf cut loose in a storm. I was desperate to find any kind of stability, but the pain of Sophie's lies gnawed at me constantly. In my lowest moments, I almost believed that I was the person she'd painted me to be, a worthless misfit, discarded without a second thought. But my friends pulled me back from that darkness, becoming my lifeline when I had no one else. Clara, my best friend since elementary school, was there for me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. She didn't ask questions, didn't pressure me to relive the pain. Instead, she simply offered me a place to stay, no strings attached. I stayed with her longer than I'd planned, and despite my initial embarrassment, she was endlessly supportive. "You'll get through this," she'd say, offering encouragement as if she knew one day I'd find my way. With her help, I slowly started piecing together a life. I enrolled in a local community college, scraping by with odd jobs that barely covered my classes and meals, but I took it one step at a time. The work was hard, and the future was uncertain, but at least it was mine. For the first time, I felt in control of something, even if it was just the small, daily choices I made. Yet, no matter how far I tried to move forward, the shadow of my past loomed over me. I often thought about Dad and whether he'd ever wondered if Sophie's story had been the lie I knew it was. The fear of reaching out only to be pushed away again was paralyzing, so I kept my distance, choosing silence over risking more pain. Years passed, and with each one, I grew stronger. I was far from healed. Anger and betrayal simmered under the surface, but I learned to compartmentalize it, locking away my bitterness so it wouldn't consume me. My friends became my family, and I focused on my education, hoping that maybe, if I could build a successful life, I'd finally be free of Sophie's ghost. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers from old acquaintances about Sophie, her life a series of mistakes and missteps. Part of me felt satisfaction, a twisted validation that perhaps her own life was unraveling. But I forced myself to let it go, focusing instead on building my future. And then I met Max. He was like a quiet, steady light in my life, patient and kind without knowing the full extent of my scars. At first, I was hesitant to let him in. Trust didn't come easily anymore, not after being burned by my own family. But Max was gentle, his support unwavering, and slowly, I allowed myself to believe in the life we could create together. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy, like I'd found a stable ground to stand on. It was a strange, unfamiliar peace, one that filled the gaping hole my family's betrayal had left. In Max's love, I found a new sense of self, one I'd built without Sophie, without Dad, and without the twisted version of me they had once believed in. Max and I grew closer with each passing year. He became my constant, the one who anchored me through life's ups and downs without judgment or reservations. When I finally shared the full story of my past with him, I braced myself for a reaction, shock, pity, maybe even disbelief, but he just held my hand, nodding with understanding. "You're here now," he said simply, "and that's what matters." His quiet acceptance became my foundation, and in his unwavering support, I found the strength to let go of the anger and betrayal that had once defined me. With Max, I began to see a future I hadn't dared to imagine. Together, we built a life rooted in trust, laughter, and a deep respect that neither of us took for granted. My memories of Sophie and the betrayal of my family slowly dulled, becoming less of a painful reminder and more of a distant memory. Over time, the bitterness began to dissipate, replaced by a focus on the present and the life we were creating. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was living my own life, finally free of the burdens of my past. A few years later, Max proposed. As he knelt before me, his eyes filled with love and hope, I felt like my life was finally coming full circle. I was going to marry the man who had seen me through my worst days, the man who loved me without the weight of my family's history. The joy of wedding planning swept us up, and with Clara as my maid of honor, I felt surrounded by people who loved me unconditionally. There were moments, fleeting and rare, when I thought about my family. Occasionally, I'd wonder if Dad had ever come to see the truth or if he still believed in Sophie's lies. A small part of me longed to show him the life I had built, to make him proud of the person I'd become despite everything. As I addressed invitations, my thoughts drifted back to Dad. I debated sending him one, but fear held me back. The pain from years ago still lingered, the memory of that night when he'd cast me out because of Sophie's lies. I worried that reaching out would only reopen old wounds, that his reaction might confirm the rejection I had worked so hard to move past. In the end, I decided against it, choosing instead to focus on those who had been there for me, who had helped me rebuild when I had nothing. But life has a way of confronting us with the things we think we've buried. Just as I sent off the last of the invitations, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, feeling an uneasy flutter in my chest. The message was brief, almost hesitant. "This is your father. We need to talk." I stared at the words, the flood of emotions nearly overwhelming me. For so long, I had imagined what I would say to him if we ever spoke again. I thought about ignoring it, deleting the message, and leaving the past where it belonged. Yet a part of me, the same part that had longed for his approval, for his presence on my wedding day, couldn't let it go. The message from my father shook me to my core. It had been years since I'd last heard his voice, and yet here he was, out of nowhere, saying he needed to talk. I read the words over and over, feeling the weight of everything I'd buried rise to the surface. Memories of that night, he threw me out, crashed over me. His cold gaze, the unwavering way he chose Sophie's lies over the truth. My initial impulse was to delete the message, to erase this attempt at reopening old wounds. But against my better judgment, a flicker of hope held me there, urging me to respond. Maybe this was his way of making things right, of finally seeing me for who I was. I replied, agreeing to a time, and when my phone rang, I felt as nervous as I did angry. His voice was different, older, quieter, with a hint of weariness that hadn't been there before. "I owe you an apology," he started, his words carrying a heaviness I hadn't expected. He explained that Sophie had gone too far, even for him and Elaine, and that some of her recent behavior had forced him to confront the lies she'd told about me years ago. "I see things more clearly now," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I realize how much I lost by pushing you away, how wrong I was." My heart was torn. This was the apology I'd spent years longing for, and yet it felt hollow, arriving so many years too late. The damage had already been done, and I had lived with the fallout, reshaping my life around the absence of a family that had discarded me. Listening to him, I didn't feel the closure I'd imagined. Instead, a wave of resentment washed over me. Where had this insight been back then? When Sophie had painted me as a villain? Where was his doubt, his faith in me? Yet he sounded so remorseful, so broken. He told me he had made a terrible mistake, that he'd allowed his desire for peace to cloud his judgment. "If I could go back, I would, but I know I can't," he said. "But I want to be there for you now. I want to be at your wedding if you'll allow me." His words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I hadn't expected him to ask that, and it threw me into turmoil. After everything He wanted to witness my happiness, to be a part of this chapter of my life. In that moment, I didn't know how to respond. This was a man who had been my entire world, and then, in a single night, he had tossed me aside. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let him in, to believe he'd truly changed. But another part feared that inviting him back would mean reopening a chapter I'd fought so hard to close. So I told him I'd think about it, and we ended the call in silence, leaving me with a question I didn't yet know how to answer. The days leading up to my wedding were supposed to be joyful, but instead, they were clouded by an internal storm I couldn't shake. My father's apology had stirred up memories I'd tried so hard to bury, and while Clara and Max were both supportive, the decision weighed heavily on me. Part of me desperately wanted to let go, to see him at my wedding, even if just to fill the empty seat in my heart where my family used to be. But every time I imagined him there, another part of me recoiled, remembering how easily he'd believed Sophie's lies. Could I risk reopening the wound, only to watch him let me down again? After days of turmoil, I realized I needed to meet him in person. I couldn't make this decision without facing him, without seeing if he was truly remorseful or just looking for a quick fix to his guilt. When we finally met, he looked older, weighed down by a heaviness that hadn't been there before. His hands trembled as he reached out for an embrace, but I couldn't bring myself to step into it. A part of me still longed to be his daughter, but the wall I'd built around my heart held me back. He began apologizing, his words tumbling out in nervous waves. I thought I was protecting our family, he said, the guilt evident in his eyes. He admitted that he'd failed me by putting Sophie's needs above mine, that he'd chosen the easy path and believed her lies because it was simpler than facing the truth. I see now how wrong I was, how much I lost, he choked out, his voice breaking. There was regret there, a kind I'd never heard from him before, and for a moment I almost let myself believe he had changed. But the words weren't enough. I felt the weight of all the years I'd spent struggling, piecing my life back together with no help from the people who were supposed to be there for me. I told him about the nights I'd spent homeless, the jobs I'd worked to keep myself afloat, the constant ache of knowing my family had thrown me away. His eyes filled with tears, and he tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled back. The hurt was still too raw, too deep. Words alone couldn't mend the years of abandonment, the betrayal of someone who should have known me better than to believe in Sophie's lies. As our conversation wound down, he asked once more if he could come to the wedding. I could see the longing in his eyes, the need for some kind of reconciliation, but I wasn't ready to give him that peace. Not yet. I'll think about it, I said, my tone guarded. His face fell slightly, and I knew he'd hoped for a different answer, but I needed time. I needed to decide if I could truly open the door to him again, or if some wounds could never be healed. Just as I was beginning to soften toward the idea of letting Dad attend the wedding, another unexpected twist shattered that fragile hope. Clara called me, her voice laced with frustration. She'd heard from a mutual friend that Sophie was spreading rumors about me. According to Sophie, I'd supposedly fabricated everything I'd told Dad to make myself look like a victim, that I was using the sympathy of others to climb my way to a better life. Sophie, it seemed, was bitter about the life I'd built and unhappy that Dad was making any attempt to reconnect with me. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. All the memories of Sophie's twisted narratives came flooding back, the years of watching her distort reality until my own family turned their backs on me. The years of struggle, the pain, the loneliness, none of it had mattered to her. She hadn't changed. Even after all this time, she was still determined to poison my relationships, to keep me trapped in her web of lies. Rage surged through me, accompanied by that familiar feeling of helplessness, the sensation that I was right back where I'd started, battling Sophie's influence over my life. How foolish I felt, allowing myself to believe that this time would be different, that Dad's regret could somehow repair the damage. For so long, I tried to live beyond her reach, to build a life where her lies couldn't hurt me anymore. And yet here she was, still trying to tarnish my reputation, still bending the truth to make herself look blameless. That evening, I sat down with Max, my hands shaking as I recounted what Clara had told me. He listened, his expression hardening with each word. "You've done so much to put your past behind you," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "You don't owe them anything. Don't let Sophie ruin this for you." He was right. For years, I had built walls around myself to keep Sophie's chaos out, and here I was on the cusp of letting her break down those walls. Letting Dad back into my life now would mean inviting Sophie's influence in too, and I couldn't do that, not to myself, not to Max, and not to the future we were building together. After a long, agonizing night of deliberation, I made the decision to withdraw my invitation to Dad. The thought of it hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I knew it was the only way to protect the life I'd worked so hard to rebuild. I sent Dad a message, explaining my choice. I told him I wished him well, but that I couldn't risk my happiness, my stability, just to appease the past. The weight of that choice settled over me like a quiet sorrow. There was no satisfaction in the decision, only a muted sense of finality. It was the boundary I needed, but it came at a cost. The final thread to my old family was now broken, and all I could do was hope that this time, it was truly for the better. The day of the wedding was everything I'd dreamed of and more. Though a small part of me felt a familiar ache, mourning the absence of the family I'd lost, the overwhelming presence of love around me soothed it. Max, Clara, and my friends surrounded me with genuine joy and celebration. And as we all laughed and prepared, I realized that this was my true family, the people who had stood by me unconditionally. My heart swelled with gratitude and relief as I walked down the aisle, locking eyes with Max, the person who had shown me what love and stability looked like. Exchanging vows with him felt like closing the door on the years of turmoil and finally stepping into the life I had built with intention and resilience. With every word, I felt the lingering weight of betrayal and hurt lift, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. As I looked into Max's eyes, I saw the future I'd longed for, free from the ghosts of my past. For the first time, I felt whole. Clara stood beside me, beaming, her support a constant reminder of the family I'd created, a family of choice, loyalty, and unwavering belief in one another. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued, Clara approached me with a look of hesitation. "Hey," she said gently, holding out a small, folded piece of paper. "Your dad left this for you." My pulse quickened as I took it, my fingers brushing the familiar handwriting on the outside. For a brief second, I felt a tug of the old longing, a flash of the little girl who had once yearned for his approval. With shaky hands, I opened the note and read his words. It was an apology, a soft, final attempt to bridge the gap. He said he understood my decision, that he respected my choice even if it hurt him, and that he would always be here if I ever changed my mind. The note stirred up a swirl of emotions. Relief, sorrow, and a lingering hope I wasn't ready to face. I folded the paper and tucked it away, feeling a bittersweet sense of closure. This time, I wouldn't let it consume me. There would be a day when I'd read it again, when I might make peace with all that had happened. But today wasn't that day. Today was mine. As the day unfolded, I felt a quiet release, a shedding of the burdens I had carried for so long. Sophie's grip on my life, her toxic shadow over my family, finally loosened. The scars she'd left remained, but they no longer defined me. I was finally free to live, surrounded by people who chose me for me. And as I looked around at Max, Clara, and my friends, I knew I had everything I'd ever truly needed. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. A few months after the wedding, life felt almost blissfully ordinary. Max and I were settling into our new rhythm, building our future one step at a time, free from the shadows of my past. But one afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I opened the message, and my heart dropped as I saw Sophie's name. Her message was unlike any I'd ever received from her. She was in rehab, she explained, and part of her recovery involved making amends. Her words were raw, stumbling over admissions of jealousy and insecurity that she claimed had fueled her actions for years. She said she didn't fully understand why she'd done what she did to me, only that it had become a twisted way to cope with her own feelings of inadequacy. It was an apology of sorts, but as I read her words, something felt incomplete, as if she were trying to absolve herself without fully confronting the depth of the pain she'd caused. The desperation behind her message was palpable. She was grasping for forgiveness, clinging to the hope that my acceptance might somehow redeem her. But as I read her words, I realized that what she sought wasn't reconciliation, it was relief. Relief from the guilt, the weight of her actions that had finally caught up to her. There was no acknowledgement of the years I'd lost, the family she'd fractured, or the toll her lies had taken on me. The message was more about her than me, and I knew I wasn't ready to let her shift the burden onto my shoulders. I sat with her message for a long time, wondering if a reply might give me the closure I'd never had. But I knew in my heart that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on my terms, not hers. I wasn't ready to offer her the release she sought, and maybe I never would be. For so long, Sophie's actions had defined the boundaries of my life. But this time, I had the power to decide what those boundaries would be. I chose silence, not out of spite, but as a way to protect the peace I had worked so hard to build. As days turned to weeks, I found that her message held less and less power over me. My choice not to reply was its own form of closure, a reminder that I no longer had to carry the weight of her expectations or her guilt. I had built a life filled with love, respect, and genuine connections, a life free from the chaos Sophie had once brought into my world. And over time, I came to accept that not every story needs a perfect ending. Some people may never fully understand the pain they cause, and that's okay. I had moved on, built a life on my own terms, and that I realized was more than enough. The years that followed brought a quiet peace I had once thought unreachable. With time, I let go of the lingering need for validation from my family, finding strength and fulfillment in the life I had created with Max. Sophie's betrayal had left its scars, but they no longer defined me. I had found healing not through dramatic reconciliations, but in the people who had shown up for me time and again. My friends and Max's unwavering loyalty became my true family, the kind of family I had dreamed of but never believed I could find. Dad and I maintained a cordial, distant relationship, though we both knew the bond we'd once had was gone. The rare phone calls, brief holiday messages, and occasional updates were a reminder of the fractured past we shared, and I knew that there were parts of him I would never be able to trust again. But with that distance, I also found a strange sort of peace. Our relationship would never be what it once was, yet I was okay with that. I didn't need him to complete my life anymore. I had built something far more valuable. As for Sophie, I left her message unanswered. She had been a constant presence in my life for so long, even when I hadn't wanted her to be, and choosing to stay silent felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I didn't need her apology, nor did I feel compelled to offer her forgiveness. She was on her own journey now, one that no longer intersected with mine. Sometimes, in the quiet of a reflective moment, I wondered if she had ever truly found redemption, but I knew it wasn't my burden to carry. Her path was hers alone, and I had found peace in letting it be. With Max by my side, I found joy in the simple moments of our life together, the small, steady routines that became the foundation of a peaceful existence. I learned that family wasn't bound by blood, but by those who chose to stand by me, who saw me as I was without the distortions of the past. Together, Max and I built a life defined by trust and mutual respect, free from the chaos that had once consumed me. We created a home that was our own, a sanctuary that was unshakable and filled with love. In the end, I found my closure not in forgiveness, but in acceptance. My life was no longer about what I had lost, but about what I had gained and built on my own terms. The past remained a part of me, but it no longer held the power to define me. With each passing day, I felt more certain that I had finally found a home within myself, steady, unshakable, and free. And as I looked at the life I had created, I knew that was all I truly needed.